Hey guys, Tom Barclay here, just doing a review of Spurs' 2-2 draw with Man United. A bit of a strange game in the sense that how Spurs fans will be feeling, and Man United fans, how they'll be feeling, as well as the coaching staff and players after that game, is hard to tell, really. Both could have won it, both maybe should have won it, both easily could have lost it, and in the end, it was a draw right at the end. It was a strange match also because for about 84 minutes, it felt not far off like a rerun of the final in Bilbao, which, as great a moment as it was for Spurs, to the point where I ended up chronicling it in a book, as you can see. Miracle in Bilbao, still out in various places, including Amazon, if you want to have a read if you haven't yet. Uh, Everyone pretty much knows the game itself was a pretty dreary affair, and that's being quite kind. It wasn't a good match, even though it was a fantastic occasion in the end for Spurs. And whilst I don't think it quite plumbed the depths in terms of lack of quality, this game at home to Man United for the first 84 minutes, it wasn't a great watch either. There weren't a lot of chances. Man United probably edged it. Spurs looked short of ideas at times. And you could sense a bit of a growing frustration in the game from the fans in particular. But then there was plenty of action. All hell broke loose pretty much in the final 6 minutes of normal time, and then about 6 or 7 minutes of injury time, in which obviously there were two goals in injury time. So first of all, obviously Brian Mbumu gives them the lead in the first half. A goal which, to be honest, Spurs are slightly the architects of their own downfall because they should have cleared it. Mathys Tel in particular should have cleared it. They had a few chances to get it away, but in the end, a really fine cross from Amad Diallo, who I really like as a player, on his weaker left foot, is headed in by Mbumu, who just 24 hours earlier in the press conference, Thomas Frank had talked him up as the complete winger. This is a player that Frank obviously brought to England and to Brentford, and specifically from Ligt. Took him to the Championship with Brentford, and developed him into one of the best wide forwards going, really, particularly in the Premier League. Obviously, he signed for United for 71 million in the summer, off the back of a season where he'd scored 20 Premier League goals for Frank. I'm pretty sure Spurs would have liked to have signed him too. I'm not sure they ever really got close. Mbeumo, obviously, I think he fancied Man United from the off. I'm led to believe, or perhaps there'll be pushback on this, that the wages at Man United were far higher than perhaps what, if there was going to be a chance for Spurs, if they were going to sign him, what they would have paid. But anyway, ultimately he ended up at Man United, and he looks a really good player. He's in a rich vein of form now. That's 4 goals and 4. And it was a good header, but like I say, Spurs should have cleared it probably. And then the second half, Spurs had a few opportunities, but really Man United looked, I thought, relatively comfortable. And then Mathys Tel scores a really good goal. And I'll come on to obviously his substitution, which is probably the main flashpoint in the game, apart from the goals themselves. I'll come on to that in a second, but let's just talk about the goal itself from Tel. Apparently, according to Tel himself, it was a bit of a training ground move, one that he'd been working on for a while, but it was really well done from him to take a touch, to hold the ball up, move away from Ligt, who's a powerhouse of a defender. And then, yes, his shot takes a wicked deflection off Ligt, but it was a really good hit in the first place and a well-deserved goal from a player who's had, up and down time so far under Frank. He's played well against Leeds, but he's still not really viewed to be playing quite well enough to be the starting striker, even with Dominic Solanke out. But there's definitely vast improvements, I think, we've seen from Tel compared to most of last season when he first came in on loan. And it was a really good contribution from Tel. And then Spurs looked like they've won it in the first minute of injury time, where Odegaard, who made such a difference coming off the bench, fires in this shot, I think it is, and Richarlison does, I think, really well. I think he means it, to flick the ball with his head into the back of the net, and it sparked absolute wild celebrations from there, with him ripping off his shirt and looking like he'd done it for Spurs. And remember, he's not had it easy this season because, yes, he's stayed fit, which has been a bit of a sea change for him personally, and it's great to see him actually taken to the pitch so much after so many injury problems. But at the same time, I think fans are starting to get frustrated by the lack of goals and lack of output from him. And presumably that reaction, not only from the game itself, but kind of suggested that he was in need of a goal, particularly after missing a penalty the other day against Copenhagen. And it looked like it would win the game, but no, there was a sting in the tail. Deep into injury time now, 6 minutes of injury time on the clock. Man United take a corner, very disappointing from Spurs' perspective, given how they pride themselves on set pieces, particularly both offensively and defensively. But the ball is swung to the far post by Bruno Fernandes in what is a bit of a trend of Premier League teams doing this, firing a corner to the far post. Spurs themselves did it against Everton, where Kudus fired it to the back post and Bentancur effectively shouldered it back across for Van de Ven to score. Seem to remember Pape Sarr's goal, was it? When Xavi Simons fired it a corner in it against West Ham for his first assist, was a similar kind of goal back to the back post, and they're definitely not the only club to do it, but they were undone by it here. Ligt basically free of a marker right at the back post, heads in. Vakari does his best to try and keep it out, but it does definitely go over the line. And 2-2 is the score, which is probably overall a fair result, but again, a frustrating one for both teams, really, given the positions they were in late into the game, winning positions, which they both threw away. Thomas Frank, it was... Personally, I felt he went a little defensive in his team selection, a little cautious. I think specifically the choice of Jed Spence at left back. As much as I think Jed Spence is a fantastic player and he's a really good one-on-one defender, I think those attributes, that attribute specifically, one-on-one defender, was why he was picked for this game, to come up against probably what they thought was going to be Bryan Mbeumo, although actually he played off the left in this match, with Cunha starting up top and Amad Diallo starting on the right. But Diallo himself, is such a good player that he can cause more than enough problems. And the way that Spence really locked down Mbeumo in last season when Spurs beat Thomas Frank's Brentford 2-0, you could sort of see the logic behind playing him for his defensive capabilities. But I just thought Destiny Udogie was so good in midweek against Copenhagen, getting forward. And Tom Allnut made a really good point in the Tottenham Way podcast we've just done about how he basically plays much further forward as a fullback compared to Spence. And obviously he has the natural balance of being left-footed, that he just offers more from an attacking perspective. And I felt like that's kind of what Spurs could have done with today. But Frank, in what sort of feels like an example of how he's naturally more cautious, at least at this stage in his Tottenham tenure, and perhaps just generally as a manager, he went with the player that he thought would counter United's threats rather than and trying to stop them from scoring rather than breaking them down themselves to try and score. And then you could also argue, I thought, Odegaard, after his performance in midweek against Copenhagen, where he seemed to really dovetail beautifully with Udogie and Xavi Simons in the middle, was worthy of a start as well. Now, I don't know about those two players, Udogie and Odegaard, whether they weren't quite sharp enough to start this game, having played in midweek. But from what I seem to remember Frank's comments before the game, it sounded like it was just a selection choice. And when you look at Frank's comments after the game, he was sort of hailing the defensive performance of his team, limiting Man United to 5 shots, which no doubt was an achievement, given the flow, as he put it, that Man United are in right now, having been unbeaten in the last 4 games, winning 3 of them. But again, you're playing at home against anyone, and this Man United team are definitely not world beaters. It felt like, personally, I would have liked to see a bit more sort of ambition in the sense of trying to make things happen and set a team up to make things happen rather than look to stop the other team from making things happen. That was my opinion. Love to hear your thoughts on this, the guys. Do you agree? Do you think I'm being a bit harsh there? But that's the way I saw it. And really that ended up for me in the first half, leading to sort of lack of chances that Spurs had. Yes, they had that early chance from Richarlison where Brennan Johnson, who gets a lot of stick for his crossing ability, fires in an absolute peach of a cross on his weaker left foot, which is just begging to be headed home. And Richarlison gets a really sort of meek, tame flick to it, and the chance is gone. And perhaps if that had gone in, that would have changed the dynamic of the match. But that was really as good as it got in the first half for Spurs, who were pretty underwhelming. There was one moment actually where Van der Ven got on the ball and took a couple of strides forward, and that was the sort of loudest and most excited the Spurs fans got in the first half, because after the week where he scored, which is presumably going to be the Puskás winner already with that amazing dribble and goal against Copenhagen, there was a sort of, for a minute, a sort of excitement that maybe something similar could happen, but it didn't. He actually played the safe option and passed it onto a colleague. Then there's the Mbeumo goal, which I've talked about, where Sarr probably should have cleared it, and Spurs had the chances, and Mbeumo tucks it away. And at half time, I have to say, there was a smattering of boos, not loads, definitely nothing like last week against Chelsea, where half time there were quite a lot of boos. Full time there were loads of boos, and there were also some in the game itself. But it did suggest, once again, the sort of the noise and the frustration that came from it, to me, sounded like fans who are getting a little bit tired of some of these unambitious home performances at this point. And I think Frank knew he needed to change it up, and so he did. He brought on Odegaard at half time, surprisingly, to a certain extent. Mawani went off. So, Frank afterwards said he'd been struggling a bit, but it was nothing too big. So he went off, and Richarlison stayed on. He was probably quite lucky to stay on because he wasn't playing that well. But actually, instantly, Spurs had a much better, much more, like I say, ambitious approach, more positive approach in the second half. And if it weren't for Senny Lemons making two very good saves, first from Romero at close range, and then Paulinho after a corner, I think it was, they would have been on level terms earlier. And they were two very good saves. But even saying that, as the half wore on, you still felt that Man United, as much as they were sort of reverting a bit into their shells, they looked fairly comfortable. And then when Frank went to bring off Xavi Simons with the team 1-0 down, that instantly sparked quite a reaction from the home fans who to be honest booed en masse at that stage. And you couldn't help thinking, as certainly some of my Spurs supporting friends made aware to me during that moment on text, of the potential parallels to the Nuno Espirito Santo moment where he subbed off against Man United in what proved to be his final game in charge, Lucas Moura, who'd been playing well for Steven Bergwijn, and the Spurs fans weren't having it. Now, no doubt, whatever happens in today's game, there was going to be no chance in my mind of a sort of a repeat of Nuno's ill-fated and short-lived tenure coming to a close for Frank. But it sort of spoke to the frustration, like at times, that seems to be growing amongst some fans, particularly after the Chelsea game with these home performances, albeit somewhat alleviated in midweek against Copenhagen with a really good win, a big scoreline, but also a fantastic performance. Albeit against not a great Copenhagen side. But at that point in this Man United game, back in the Premier League, that's kind of what it felt like with all these boos. But then you got to say the change was vindicated, because on comes Tel, and he's the one who scores the equaliser, and he does really, really well. So I don't know. It's a funny one. Speaking to some of my one of my colleagues who covers Man United a lot, he did get the sense that the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is a place where fans are often ready to turn at times, and that opposition can sort of sense that and make the most of it. And I hadn't really thought of it that way, but now that I do think there might be something in that, which is kind of where Vicario and Frank were coming from ahead of the Copenhagen game, where they both sort of called for a bit of help at times from the crowd, and how that help can sort of roar the team on. Maybe there is something in that, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether that's being too harsh. Obviously, fans pay loads of money at Tottenham to go, so they have their right to voice their opinion. But whether they went too strong too early in this particular game, a bit different against Chelsea. They were so bad in that match. I understand it, but that would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that one. Anyway, obviously Tel scores. Then comes a moment which we can't overlook, which was Van der Ven doing what Van de Ven does, racing back in a way that only he can to put in this unbelievable last-ditch tackle on Benjamin Šeško, just when he looked like he was going to make it 2-1 to Man United. So that was huge. Then comes Richarlison's goal. Pandemonium comes in before Ligt, basically causes heartbreak for pretty much everyone with a Tottenham hat on during the game. Getting a little bit of revenge, I suppose, on Spurs, particularly given that he was part of a Ajax team back in 2019 who had their hearts broken by Lucas Moura, quite famously, Champions League semi-final. So lastly, let's just talk about some of the comments that Frank said after the game. He said that he was happy generally with how he limited, as I said before, United, who were in this flow, to 5 shots. Extremely happy with the second half. He didn't need reminding about the importance of winning at home. He actually brought it up himself before any of us journalists could chime in and remind him that how important it is to win at home. So it's clearly on his mind. And then he was asked about the Xavi booing. Did he hear it? What do you think? And he just chose to answer like this. He said, every time I make a decision, it's with one aim: to make the team better, to go and win the game effectively. That was his response. But I'd be intrigued to know what he privately thought of that. I wonder if there's a frustration there. But ultimately, he was vindicated, wasn't he? And even when he was asked about that, he said, sometimes you get lucky. So he was quite modest about the way it ended up. And you wonder with other managers who can be a bit more sort of wear the heart on their sleeve. Perhaps even his predecessor, he might have been a bit stronger in that situation than Frank was. But Frank chose the diplomatic route, as he often does. To his credit, to be fair, not to have a go at the fans, even if some might feel that, given what happened afterwards, he might be well within his rights to. I mentioned what he said about Muani. On Romero, who came off with 2 minutes to go, actually, he just said he was physically done, having just come back from injury. But he'll be fine for the international break from Argentina's perspective. And he also said, I asked him the question, obviously they conceded from a set piece right at the end, which will be a huge disappointment to Frank and Andreas Georgeson and the team. Not having Romero there, how much of an impact did that have? But he said basically nothing, because Romero would have been in the middle of the box where he lines up. It wasn't like Spence at Newcastle, who would have apparently been marking Fabian Schär that day. So he chose not to. He said it wouldn't have made a difference. And he was asked about Odegaard, my good friend George Sessions, also of the Tottenham way, because Odegaard seemed to have such an impact off the bench. And he basically said, he's impressed with how he's stepping up. And it's one to see, really, whether Odegaard can really start to build on what he's done this week. It's obviously a tough game after the international break with the North London derby, but I think there was real green shoots from his perspective. So let me know your thoughts, guys. What did you reckon? Were you left completely frustrated, or did you see reasons to be optimistic? What did you make of the attacking options at the moment, particularly with Solanke, which I've sort of neglected to mention because I didn't end up doing a review of the press conference. That was probably the top line, really, from a news perspective, was that Frank, when I asked him, are we going to see Solanke before 2026, given how long this has been rumbling on for? He said he hopes so, but I don't think his answer was convincing to the point where you feel you'd be confident that he definitely will be fit before then. Let's wait and see. I suppose maybe he didn't want to say either way, because he's clearly not quite sure. But with him missing, what do you think? Tel, maybe it's his chance to have him come off the bench, or do you feel Richarlison, now he's got his goal, might have the confidence, or maybe it's Muani, as long as he can stay fit? Let me know your thoughts, guys. Where do you think Spurs are at? What did you make of the performance overall? Was it ambitious enough, or should we be praising Spurs, who right now, when I look at the table, they're third in the league, they didn't lose, and they're still going pretty strong in the early days of Thomas Frank? Love to hear your thoughts. Cheers, guys.